Welcome to the second video in the Watercolor Workshop, brought to you by thevirtualinstructor.com, Brushes and Surfaces. In this module, we'll look at a few of the most popular brushes and hair types for watercolor painting, watercolor paint ingredients, watercolor papers, and stretching watercolor paper. Choosing a brush for a particular application is personal for artists. The value of the brush is not necessarily tied to the price. Instead, the performance of the brush in the artist's hand is how the brush should be evaluated, no matter the price or material it is constructed from. Let's take a look at a few of the most popular brush types for watercolor painting. These are the brushes we'll be using mostly through the course. The first brush is a round brush. The fibers in this brush are synthetic, specifically nylon. New brushes will have gum material in them to keep the hairs stiff. When water is added, this gum material will dissipate. The second brush is a flat synthetic brush. This brush is also made of nylon fibers. The third brush I'll be using is a mop brush, and this particular brush is made out of goat hair fibers. Mop brushes are great for spreading color over large areas. Another brush good for spreading large amounts of color over areas is a hake brush. This particular one is also made of goat hair. It will make marks very similar to the flat synthetic brush, but will cover a larger area. We'll also be using round brushes made of sable hair as well. And then the last brush we'll be using throughout the series is a rigger or script brush. This particular brush is made out of synthetic hair as well, specifically nylon. So if you're looking to get your brushes in order in preparation for the course, these are the brushes that we'll be using predominantly throughout the course. Of course, we'll use different sizes of each one of these types of brushes, specifically the round brush, which we'll be using more often than the other brushes. Watercolor, or aquarelle, is mostly produced in one of two forms. The medium and liquid form is produced in tubes, while solid cake forms are also available. Watercolor found in tubes is generally more expensive than that found in watercolor cakes. We'll be using both of these types throughout the series. Tubes of watercolor paint feature watercolor paint in a liquid form. Therefore, it's easier to mix on a palette. For most demonstrations throughout the series, we'll be using watercolor paint in the tube form. Watercolor cakes, on the other hand, are much more convenient. It's easier to grab the color you need without having to open a tube of paint. However, watercolor paints in this form are easily muddied from taking color from one cake to the next. You'll most likely discover that you prefer one form of the watercolor over the other. Watercolor paint is produced by a variety of different manufacturers, but all watercolor paint has generally a similar compositional makeup. However, you will find that different brands vary the amount of ingredients that are included in their watercolor paint. Variants in the ingredients that are included in watercolor paints do affect the quality and consistency of the watercolor paint itself. Let's take a look at a few of the ingredients. Like with all paint, pigment is included in watercolor paint. Pigment is usually in powder form, is mostly natural but can also be synthetic, and adds color to the paint. The second ingredient is the binder. For watercolor paint, the binder is gum arabic. Binder is the material that holds the pigment together. Watercolor paint also includes additives that improve the consistency of the paint. These may include glycerin or honey. And of course, there's the solvent, and in the case of watercolor paint, the solvent is water. Watercolor is typically applied to a paper surface. There are special watercolor papers that are specially designed to absorb the water found in watercolor paint. Let's take a look at a few of the characteristics for each one of these types of watercolor paper. The first type of watercolor paper, and perhaps the most popular type of watercolor paper, are cold press papers. These are referred to as cold press because during the manufacture process, they are rolled on cold cylinders. The resulting texture is one that has an irregular dimple pattern. Another type of watercolor paper are hot press papers. These are less popular but still available for watercolor artists. Hot press papers are called so because the cylinders involved in the manufacturing process are heated. This causes the paper to conform to the texture of the cylinder itself, resulting in a very smooth surface. The third type are rough watercolor papers. Rough watercolor papers are not manufactured using cylinders at all. Instead, these papers are hard pressed or not pressed at all. The resulting texture is extremely rough, as the name would imply. Watercolor papers are categorized according to weight. The weight designation refers to the weight, the physical weight, of 500 sheets or a ream of that paper. Therefore, watercolor papers designated with a lighter weight are typically thinner papers. Most commonly, you'll find watercolor papers in three thicknesses: 90 pounds, which is thick enough to absorb the water, 140 pounds, which is the most common, and then 300 pounds, which is very thick. When purchasing pads of watercolor paper, you'll be able to find this information printed somewhere on the pad itself. For example, we'll be using Arches paper and Strathmore watercolor paper. These are two different brands of watercolor, but they also vary in quality. You can see here that both brands are cold press paper. They're both acid-free, as we can see here on the front of this pad, which means that they won't deteriorate over time. We can also see at the very bottom of the front of the pad that this paper is 140 pound. This means this paper is of medium thickness when compared to the 90 pound or the 300 pound papers. We can also find this information clearly printed on the Arches pad of paper. Clearly on the front we can see that this is 140 pound paper, and on the back we can notice that it is also acid-free. The tooth or texture of the paper also varies between manufacturers. The Arches paper features a finer tooth, while the Strathmore paper features a more broad tooth. You may find that you prefer one type of tooth over the other. Watercolor paper is also sold individually as large sheets. This particular Arches sheet features a watermark that you'll see in the bottom corner. While many people argue over which side is the best side to use for watercolor, it's my opinion that it doesn't really matter. You'll find through experimentation which side suits your particular technique the best. Some artists prefer to stretch their papers in order to prevent unwanted buckling of the paper as heavy washes are applied. Not all artists choose to stretch their paper, but if you find that you prefer heavy washes, it may benefit you to do so. Let's take a look at a couple strategies for stretching your watercolor paper. For larger papers, it may be suitable to completely submerge the paper in a container of water. In this case, a bathtub is used. The paper is gently lowered into the surface and completely submerged. Allow the paper to sit anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes. Then you can remove the paper and apply it to a board. Using your fingers or a sponge, you can remove any excess wrinkles. While the paper is still wet, staple the paper to the board. Be sure to put an ample number of staples in the paper all the way around. A spacing of 1 to 3 inches should provide enough support for the paper to dry equally. Allow the paper to dry fully and then cut it from the board or paint directly on the board support. For smaller papers, we can stretch the paper directly on the board support. First, we'll take the smaller paper and adhere it to the surface using masking tape. Once we have taped all 4 sides of the paper to the surface, we can use a Hake brush and will apply a heavy amount of water to the surface. As the water dries, the surface will become very strong and tight, and will be ready for painting. So what did we discuss in this module? We looked at common brush types and shapes, including round brushes, flat brushes, the hake brush, mop brushes, and a rigger or script brush, as well as the popular hair types, sable, synthetic, and goat hair. We also took a look at watercolor paint ingredients and its forms, and we took a look at watercolor papers and how they're categorized: cold press, hot press, rough, and then their weights: 90, 140 pound, and 300 pounds. We also took a look at stretching watercolor paper. In the next video in this series, we're going to take a look at some common watercolor application techniques.